The colonial period played a decisive role in the history of Islam in Africa. It was the period of the great expansion of the Muslim presence in Africa. This paradox should be borne in mind when, on the scale of the millennium, one draws the balance of this significant period, which extends essentially from the mid-19th century to 1960. At the summit of its empire, France prided itself in being a major Muslim power due to its possessions of the Maghreb, Black Africa, the Middle East. This expression was ambiguous, for under the pretext of recognizing its Muslim subjects, France's interest lay rather in competing with the British Empire by symbolically vying for control over the territory of Islam. Yet, it is precisely the comparison with France's great British rival that permits one to better emphasize the existence of French specificity in Islamic matters. In Africa, for example, in the Sudan and Nigeria, under the doctrine of indirect rule, the British delegated local powers of jurisdiction to the holders of Islamic legitimacy, although under British control. France, for its part, even when it made use of the mediation of the Muslim Brotherhoods, often refused to invest them with a recognized legal power. This was not merely a question of different conceptions of colonial policy, but also concerned a particular representation of Islam. On the part of the Muslims, only a minority of Muslim leaders resisted colonialism or tried to avoid conquest by making the hijrah, that is, migrating beyond the reaches of colonial authorities. The majority, however, chose accommodation and collaboration. Public opinion in West Africa was not critical of the elites that collaborated with colonial powers. Indeed, religious leaders sometimes placed the defeated aristocracies as intermediaries with the colonial authorities, as was the case among the Wolof. Jula traders whose trade benefited from the consolidation of colonial rule adopted the same attitude to the new rulers as they had towards the previous non-Muslim rulers. Likewise, the ulama of East Africa protectorate were co-opted into the regime's service as salaries qadis and other native officials. The expansion of Islam accelerated during the colonial period. The opening of routes and railways facilitated the installation of Muslim colonies in southern regions. In northern Nigeria, the British helped the expansion of Islam by extending the rule of Muslim amirs to neighboring pagan areas. In East Africa, under British and German rule, Muslim trading stations developed into administrative centers where most of the government officials were Muslim. People from the countryside migrated to those growing urban centers like Tabora, where they came under Muslim influence. In Malawi, freedom and security of movement of Muslim traders and clerics facilitated the expansion of Islam, as did the fact that most of the British colonial troops were Muslims. Further into the interior of East Africa, in the eastern provinces of Congo and Burundi and Rwanda, Swahili-speaking Muslims were recruited by Germans to serve as interpreters and soldiers. Their quarters became the nucleus of urban centers, where rural people migrated and settled. The process of mutual assimilation to this new dominant culture took place as the indigenous people converted to Islam while the foreign Muslims adopted the local language. The French colonial administration seems to have cultivated an Islamic policy that changed over time. At first, they encouraged Islam, which they perceived as an advanced stage in the evolutionary process from animism to Western civilization. But when they felt threatened by Islam, the French invented the concept of Islamic neo to distinguish African Islam from Arab Islam. In the 1920s, the French constructed an imagined struggle between Islam and animism, which is the attribution of a living soul to plants, inanimate objects, and natural phenomena. In the 1950s, they supported traditional Muslim leaders against attacks by the reformers, who sought to Arabize African Islam. During their brief conquest of Ethiopia, in order to undermine the foundations of the Christian state, the Italians pursued a pro-Islamic policy. They granted Muslims full freedom of religion, encouraged mosque building, appointed qadis, and introduced Arabic in all Muslim schools. They facilitated a pilgrimage or Hajj to Mecca and allowed the propagation of Islam. brotherhoods changed roles in their relation to the colonial authorities. Whereas in Algeria, the Qadiriya resisted the French and the Tijaniya collaborated with them. In West Africa, the Tijaniya led resistance to the French. With the consolidation of colonial rule, most leaders of the brotherhoods, including the Tijaniya, collaborated with the authorities. The French administration supported those movements, which already had become accommodated to colonial rule, and repressed those who challenged their movements. This was the case of the Hamaliya, which challenged the mainstream of the Tijaniya. Following the defeat of the Mahdiya in the Sudan, the British became allied with Sayyid Ali al-Mirghani, the Mahdi's rival. Cooperating with the Khatmiya gave a certain aura of Islamic legitimacy to British rule. The British policy that aimed to suppress the Mahdiya changed when the Mahdi's son, Sayyid Abdurrahman al-Mahdi, set out to reconstruct the Ansar as a successor to the Mahdiya within the tradition of popular Islam and in reconciliation with British authorities. The two largest Muslim associations, the Ansar and the Khatmiya, were accepted as representing the voices of Sudanese society. Leaders of holy families also became involved in nationalist movements and politics during the joint control of the Muslim states. During the colonial period, the existence of an alternative Muslim educational system insulated the Muslim community from the modernizing tendencies associated with Western education. Where Muslims lived close to Christians, as in Lagos, Freetown, Mombasa, Cape Town, and Durban, they organized earlier and more aggressively to create a modern school system that will combine Islamic and Western education. This was the case of the Young Ansaruddin Society, founded in 1923, that established and ran Western schools among Yoruba Muslims. During the colonial period, women took an active part in movements of popular learning and piety. Women, some of them Western educated, devoted time to prayers, learned the Quran, preached to other women, and performed voluntary services. Female participation in Arabic schools is very high, often reaching more than half of the student population. Many women went to Mecca off-season. Hence, the Umrah, which unlike the Hajj may be performed at any time of the year, became known as the women's pilgrimage. Efforts to give women a greater role in religious life were opposed by the reformers. Women responded to the challenge of the fundamentalists by embracing distinctive Muslim dress, including the veil, but at the same time they became more active politically and formed their own organizations. Under the Islamist regime in the Sudan, fewer women enrolled to certain types of medical and technical training. Women became excluded from high-ranking and better salaried positions.